that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have touched, the word of life.
Family feuds can last a long time. My father and his brother had a disagreement when my father was 16 years of age. It lasted until he died at age 80. They didn't actually fight, they just avoided one another. The Bible has been about a family feud between God and man. It started in the garden when God said, "I just want to bless you, obey me." Of course, they disobeyed. So then he called a man by the name of Abraham, and he made them a great nation. He said, "I just want to bless you. I'll bless your obedience. I'll curse your disobedience." But they disobeyed. And so we've been following God's warning to his people that judgment always follows disobedience. God never judges without a warning. We have looked at 8 prophets. Israel was warned by 2 prophets, but there were an additional 6 that were not written, that don't have a book of the Bible with their name on it. People like Elisha and Elijah. And there were 5 other prophets that warned Judah, people like Jehaziel. And then we've already studied the 5 major prophets. Isaiah warned everybody, judgment is coming. Jeremiah for 40 years said, judgment is coming, get right. And you know what that got him? Beatings and imprisonment. He lamented, he wrote the book of Lamentations, he lamented when judgment came and Jerusalem was destroyed. We had Ezekiel and Daniel that were both written during the exile of the southern kingdom. And they had visions. Ezekiel saw the glory of God leaving the land, but then he also saw the dry bones come back to life. So he saw the restoration. Daniel saw all of history, and he realized God was sovereign over history. Then we saw Hosea. He was sent to Israel to warn them that they were unfaithful, like an unfaithful wife, and how God loved them anyway. Joel showed Judah how extreme the judgment would be. It would be like locusts devouring the land. And Amos held a plumb line up to Israel and said, "You're out of line. Judgment is coming." This reminds me of when Travis was a little boy, he was afraid of lightning and thunder. And although it was not good theology, I said to him, "Don't be afraid, Travis, that's just God talking." He went over to the door, looked into the sky, and said, "Hey, God, would you mind talking a little softer? You're hurting my ears." Well, I get the feeling that that's the way God's people should be feeling. Would you talk a little softer? You're hurting my ears. That's a lot of warning, isn't it? We come to the book of Obadiah, and he's warning someone else. He's warning the Edomites. We don't know anything about the man Obadiah. There are 12 or 13 of them in the Bible. We don't know when he lived. But on your chart, the writing date is 840 BC, which would actually make this the first prophet written down. We don't know when it was written, but we do know from the text it was a time when Jerusalem had been defeated and the Edomites were gloating over it. The Assyrians and the Babylonians are not mentioned in this book, so it is believed that the probable date was 840, right after the Philistines destroyed Jerusalem. The hardest part about this book will be finding it. Would you like to do that? It is the smallest book in the Old Testament. It's only 21 verses long. But small does not necessarily mean unimportant. I can have a small message like fire. It's important, isn't it? And this book has a very important message for us. Verse 1, it's the vision of Obadiah. Thus says the Lord God concerning Edom, we've heard a report. An envoy has been sent among the nations. Arise, let us go against Edom for battle. Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You are greatly despised. We get the picture. God isn't too pleased with Edom. He says he's going to send out nations to fight them. He's going to make them small, and they are despised. Now, why would God be so worked up about the Edomites? I think we need to understand the history to get that clearly in our minds. So if you would put something in here so we can find it again, and come back to Genesis chapter 25, the very first book of the Bible. And we'll find the history of this country. In verse 19, we find that Abraham had a son, Isaac. Isaac had the same problem that his father did. He married Rebekah, but they didn't have babies. But we're told in verse 21 that Isaac did something very smart when he had a problem. He prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. The Lord answered. Rebekah's wife conceived, but the children struggled together within her. She said, if it be so, why am I this way? So she went to inquire of the Lord. All right, we find a couple things. First of all, he was 40 years old when he got married, but if you read on down, you find he was 60 years old when these babies were born. It tells us he prayed, God answered. My question is, do you think he waited till he was 59 to start praying? Or do you think he started praying at 40 but had to wait 20 years for an answer? It doesn't tell us, but I think there's a little message in there for us somehow. But we know that she did conceive, and there were twins in her womb. And they are struggling together within her. God says in verse 23, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 peoples. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Now that was not common for the younger to get the birthright. The birthright was given to the oldest son. It included several things. It included a double portion of the material goods, the inheritance, but it also meant that that person was the family priest. He had the spiritual leadership in the family. Even though it was not common, it should have been understood by this family because Isaac himself was the second born who was given the spiritual birthright. We're told in verse 25 that the birth time came, and the first came forth red all over like a hairy garment. They named him Esau. Doesn't sound like too cute a newborn, does it? Afterward, his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. We have the names of these 2 boys now, Jacob and Esau. Esau is the firstborn, and we see that they have conflict from the womb. These two brothers start battling. There's a struggle in the room, and there's even a struggle during the birth process where the one's trying to grab at the other. Two brothers with conflict from the womb. Well, it doesn't stop there. Verse 27 says they grow up. Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a peaceful man. Now, they may have been twins, but they weren't identical. They were very different. Esau's kind of the man's man, and Jacob's kind of the delicate one. Verse 28 tells us Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for the game that he caught, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now we see another problem about family feuds, and actually something that can cause one: parental preference. A parent choosing or preferring one child over another. I've actually heard a man say, well, Mom and Dad always did more for you than they did for me. Could your kids say that? I fortunately had a mother who has a brother. She loves this brother. He's a wonderful guy. But my mother always had the impression from her mother that the mother preferred the brother over my mother. So my mother made a vow she would never do that to her children. And she hasn't. If she does something for one, she does it for the other, which has been great. It has meant that I have never had to compete with my brother because I always knew things were even. Boy, what a warning to us about parental preference. Well, we know the next story, probably it's about Esau coming in from hunting hungry. And his brother Jacob is at work in the kitchen making some red soup. And Esau says, give me some of that red stuff. And he said, I will if you give me your birthright. And Esau says, well, what good is a birthright if I'm dead of hunger? We're told that Esau despised his birthright. Now, the only thing about that story is that God had said before they were born who was going to get the birthright? The younger, Jacob. So he was bartering for something that was already his. And Esau was giving away something he didn't own. But we also see that Esau was not interested in spiritual things. All he cared about was his stomach full? How did he feel? Were his lusts being met? If you go to chapter 36, and don't do it, just let me read this to you. Chapter 36, verse 9. These are the generations of Esau, the father of the Edomites, who live in the hill country of Mount Seir. We're told there that Esau became the nation of Edom. We also know that Jacob had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. So these two brothers became two nations, Israel and Edom. We know that the conflict that started in the womb and was festered on through life, as a matter of fact, come to chapter 27, because things get worse between these two brothers. Genesis chapter 27. We remember that Isaac became old. His eyes were dim. He could not see. And he calls Esau in and he says, go out and hunt some of that game that I like. Bring it to me. I'll eat it and bless you before I die. Rebekah overhears this conversation and says to her favorite son, Jacob, go out to the pen, get an animal. I'll fix it the way your father likes, and he will bless you before he dies. Jacob says, well, I might get caught and I'll seem like a deceiver. She says, do as I say. He gets the game, she fixes it, he takes it into father, and father's a little suspicious, and he says, who are you? And Jacob says, I am Esau. I've done what you told me. And the father says, well, how could you find the game so quickly? And he says, and listen to this, because the Lord your God caused it to happen to me. Oof. Can you believe we could even bring God's name into our deception? Isaac is still suspicious, and he says, come here and let me feel you. Well, Rebekah had covered Jacob's arms with the skin of animals and had put some of Esau's clothes on him. So Jacob feels him, and He feels right. And he said, let me kiss you. And he smelled him, and he smelled right. So he ate and blessed him. I think there's a little lesson in there for us. If we make our decisions based on how things look, how things feel, how things smell, we're going to be deceived, won't we? Esau comes in, and his brother has already been blessed. And we're told that the father trembles violently. And I think he trembles violently because he realizes he has disobeyed God in even thinking about blessing the firstborn when God said from the beginning the secondborn would receive the blessing. Well, chapter 27, verse 41 tells us that Esau bore a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are near, and then I will kill my brother. This family feud that started in the womb has now become a real conflict, hasn't it? This feud that started with these two brothers continues in the scriptures. When Israel came out of Egypt to go into the promised land, they asked twice to pass through the land of Edom. We're told that Edom stifled their compassion and would not allow them to go. Not only would they not allow them to go, but they came out against them with hard force. So Edom refused Israel's passage through their land during the Exodus. But the feud continues. This feud lasted for a long time, actually over 1,000 years. If you were to reread the history books that we've already studied, you would find that Saul fought against the Edomites. David fought against the Edomites. Solomon put down a revolt of the Edomites. Many, many of the kings fought against the Edomites. This conflict lasted a long time and was very fierce. Come back to Obadiah, verse 3. The arrogance of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rock, in the loftiness of your dwelling place, who say in your heart, who will bring me down to earth? Though you build high like the eagle, though you set your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. All right, we see that Edom had a pride problem. It said they were arrogant. And the first thing we have to learn about pride from this book is that pride will deceive our hearts. Pride deceived Edom's heart. It will deceive ours as well. It is an interesting thing that pride is the source of all other sins. It's something that God says He hates. He gives a list of 6 things He hates, and it's number 1 on the list. And yet pride is difficult to see. You know, if I commit adultery or steal, it's obvious. But pride is that subtle sin of the heart that says, I don't need God. And that's really what they're saying is, we are secure without God. Self-sufficiency will be a clue that you've got a pride problem. My mother says the first words out of my mouth were, I can do it myself. I was born a sinner with a pride problem. Pride was the source of the devil's sin. He said 5 times, I will be like the Most High God. You see, pride is our attempt to be equal with God. And it is so subtle, we can have it and not even know we have it. We may be prideful that we're a good parent. We may be prideful of our success or proud of our health. By the way, I have suffered all of those. And the thing is, our next point we're going to learn from this study is that pride comes before a fall. If you're proud of your parenting And I didn't know I was proud of it, but in the back of my mind, I thought if there's one thing in this world I did well, it was be a parent. Well, then your kid will do something that really makes you look bad. And it's hard. That happened to me. And then I didn't know I was proud of my husband's success until he lost it. And I didn't know I was proud of my health. Of course, I never was sick a day in my life, and I couldn't understand people that whined about their ailments, but I didn't recognize it till I suddenly lost the sight in my right eye. I had to have 2 nasty surgeries. They put a gas bubble in there, and I had to look straight at the floor 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 2 weeks, which brought me to see another of my pride issues. I thought I was a good housekeeper. Pride deceives our hearts. Well, it deceived their hearts. They said, nobody can bring us down. You see, they were high and lofty, but God does say pride comes before a fall. That's the second thing we need to learn about pride. It first deceives our heart, and then it comes before a fall.
Well, just like the people of Edom in the book of Obadiah, I too allowed my heart to be deceived by pride. Every summer we would attend a Christian family camp at a small Christian university near our home. And in the summer of 7th grade, I returned to the camp and I dedicated my life to Christ. And from that point on, faith has been pretty constant in my life. I graduated from high school and I ended up going to that same college where we used to go for a summer camp. I went there for 4 years, and that's where I met my husband. After we graduated, I went to dental school and he went to Sichuan University in China to learn to write and read Mandarin. And so he came back a year later and I quit dental school and we got married. We had decided that we would, once we finished all of our studies, we would return to Kenya, where he was raised, and we would work for his father's company. We had 2 children. Both of my children were born in Nairobi, Kenya. And so we adjusted and our life was pretty settled. We pretty much decided that we would spend the rest of our lives there, and we led a very comfortable life. I was able to travel back to the United States once or twice a year during that time that we stayed there. And my husband was a leader in the organization in his father's business, and so we had a very comfortable, stable, and predictable life. I was a believer, I was a faithful believer. And so I didn't realize that I was struggling with anything. I just thought that my life was very peaceful, very calm, comfortable, and predictable. And all the while, in my heart, I was being deceived because I was struggling with inward pride, and I didn't recognize it. I was claiming credit where credit was due to God and not to my own ambition or my own work or the work of my husband. So in the year of 2001, God dealt with that, and He dealt with the issue of pride in my life. And He, just like in the book of Obadiah, where Obadiah prophesied that Edom's allies would attribute to its fall, God used close relationships in my life to foster the environment for my fall, to help me deal with my issue of pride. And so in February of 2001, because of a myriad of reasons, so many reasons, including the conflicts in relationships, we decided that we would leave Nairobi, Kenya. And I guess in our ignorance or our attitude of the past, we didn't think it was a big deal. We knew it would be a big relocation from Africa back to the United States, but in our old mindset of thinking, I thought, well, my husband should easily find a job. He's well educated, he has 2 masters, one's from an Ivy League, one's an MBA. The company that he and his father started while we were there was featured on CNN International. That was in February of 2001. And in December of 2001, he was still searching. There was nothing on the horizon. And that was the very first humbling event that happened that year. When we came to the United States, my husband didn't have any good prospects of a job. So we decided that I would move in with my parents. My children and I would move in with my parents, and my husband would move to New York City and live with a friend while he's looking for a job. And that was really a humbling blow for both of us. We were incomeless, we were jobless, we were homeless, we didn't have a home, we were familyless, we didn't have the family that we had been living with for the past 4 years around us. We just really felt hopeless. We were completely at our bottom. It put our focus on God being the provider, the source of our income and the source of what we had rather than ourselves. All of the things that we've surrounded ourselves with, our lives with, and not only the material, but with the academic accomplishments, with the work accomplishments. All of these things don't matter. And the only thing that matters are those things that have eternal value. My husband didn't get a job until July of 2002, but God provided, He provided us friends and mentors who loved us when we were at our lowest. The one thing I've learned about God is that He is the provider. He's the source of all that we have, all that we are, and all that we will have in the future.
Pride comes before a fall. That's the second thing we need to learn about pride. It first deceives our heart, and then it comes before a fall. And He said, who will bring you down? I will bring you down. You see, they lived in Mount Seir. Mount Seir was this rocky, high area of cliffs with sheer drop-offs and plains with just a little narrow path that went up to where they lived. They thought, an enemy can't come marching in here without us seeing them. We are safe. We're high. It's like we're up with the birds, up with the stars. No one can bring us down. They felt safe and secure in their spot without God. And God says, I will bring you down. God would bring them down. He even tells us the extent of their fall. In the next verses, He says, thieves don't steal everything when they steal, and grape gatherers don't pick all the grapes. They leave some gleanings, but your destruction will be total. And then He even tells them how they will be destroyed. He says God will use their allies. You see, God intended for all men to trust Him for their protection. But this was a small country, and they thought, well, they don't have a big army, they can't protect themselves, they need to make alliances. Verse 7 says, all the men allied with you, the men at peace with you, will deceive you and overpower you. They will set an ambush for you. So God says the very thing that they were trusting to protect them will be the thing He will use to destroy them. And the interesting thing is, in 586, they made an alliance with Babylon. Along with Babylon, they were the ones who attacked Judah and carried away the exiles into captivity. It wasn't 5 years until Babylon turned on Edom and conquered them. God said He would use their allies, and He did. The third thing we need to learn, besides the fact that pride deceives our hearts and pride comes before a fall, is that pride will cause conflict in relationships. Pride caused conflict between these brother nations. Verse 10 tells us specifically what some of the conflict was. First of all, they were violent to their brother. And He said, because of that, you will be cut off. The second thing they did was they stood aloof on the day that strangers carried off Jacob's wealth. And He says, you two were as one of them. You know, I think this is a good principle to teach your children, because enemies came in and carried off Israel's wealth, their brother's wealth, and they didn't do anything about it. They just stood and watched. And God says, you were as one of them. Bob always says he never stole a hubcap as a young man, but he was with people who did. And according to God, he was just as guilty. because he didn't do anything about it. Not only did they stand and watch their brother's pain, but verse 12 says they gloated over his misfortune. They rejoiced over his destruction. They boasted over his distress. They're not only not doing anything to help, but they're enjoying their brother's pain. The next thing they do is they do start looting the wealth themselves. And the final thing they do is when the people of Judah are trying to flee the enemy, they either cut them down and kill them, or they imprison the survivors. So they started out just not helping, then they start enjoying, and then they start adding to their brother's pain. Remember we said that pride is the source of all other sins? Look at the long list of sins we've just seen that started with pride. God says there's a solution, verse 15. The day of the Lord draws near on all nations. We've heard that day of the Lord before. But the day of the Lord is the time when God makes things right. And the first thing we read about in verse 15 is, and this is our memory verse, he says, as you have done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head. The day of the Lord is a day of retribution. What you have done will be done to you. Now that's not a principle only of the Old Testament. We find in the New Testament, you reap what you sow. And this idea is all through the Bible. Remember Pharaoh tried to kill all the babies in Moses' time by drowning them. And then God drowned his army in a Red Sea. Retribution. It's a day of retribution. But he also, I guess that could be good news too. You think of it as bad news, but if I do good, as you have done, it will be done to you. Verse 16 says, just as you drank on my holy mountain, all nations will drink and become as if they had never existed. The day of the Lord is a day when all nations will be judged. We've already read that in Isaiah and many of the other books. Verse 17 says, but on Mount Zion, that's Jerusalem, there will be those who escape, and it will be holy. You see, this is not only a day of retribution, it's a day of deliverance. God is going to deliver a remnant of Jerusalem and make Jerusalem a holy city once more. He says they will possess their possessions. They'll possess the possessions of their enemies. Fact is, verses 19 and 20 list all the land that Israel will possess at this time. The land of Esau, the land of the Philistines, on and on. Land that Israel has never possessed to this point, but will when the day of the Lord comes. Verse 18 says that the house of Jacob would be fire, but the house of Esau would be stubble. They would be set on fire and consumed, so that there would be no survivor in the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. You know, Babylon did conquer the Edomites in 581 BC. In 120 BC, the Greeks weakened them, and in 70 AD, the Romans destroyed them. There is no Edomite today. Even their city of Petra, their grand city, is ruins to this very day. Why? Because God said so. He said there will be no survivor in the house, and the Lord has spoken. You can count on it. The day of the Lord will be a day of retribution, a day of deliverance for Israel. They'll possess their enemies' possessions. They'll live in all the land. Verse 21 says, the deliverers will ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. This will be a time where God will rule and reign. The kingdom will be the Lord's. I think that this is where Jesus is concealed in this book, because Revelation 11 says the kingdom of this world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. So Jesus will reign and rule. The kingdom will be his. That day is coming. You know, this conflict came right down to Jesus' day. Jesus descended from Jacob. We know Jacob had a son, Judah, and on down we come to Jesus. But when you follow the line of the Edomites come down to the Herods. When Jesus was born, King Herod the Great was the one who tried to kill the babies in order to kill Jesus. And when Jesus grew up, it was Herod Antipas who tried to kill the adult Jesus. Family feuds can last a long time, can't they? I realized that my father's family feud actually does impact me, because I come from a very small family. We're small enough we could have our family reunions in one of those Volkswagen bugs. And yet, I have cousins in this world I have never met because of a family feud. Family feuds can start and end with us. Lots of application in this book for us, isn't there? First of all, I think it's calling for a heart check. Do I have pride? Lord, reveal any pride that's hidden to me, because I can't see it. It is subtle. It's hard to see. But I now see that pride deceives my heart, and I don't want to be deceived. And pride leads to a fall, and I sure don't want to fall. And pride leads to conflict with my brothers, and I don't want that either. Pride can be defined as our attempt to be equal with God. Humility is acknowledging there's only one God, and it isn't me.